Jesus, and it's a Christmas song from the 1100s, and it's called Down in Yon Forest. So give me just
is the Wharton show tonight. Our presenter is Roy Wharton. He's going to come up and give us a presentation on the Salt Lake Temple. And we're looking forward to it. So come on up, Roy. I told him, I already let him know we're going to be filming him and putting it on YouTube, and we're going to make him famous. So hopefully you have some good dark sunglasses.
No pressure.
No.
I'm famous.
Yes. You're already famous.
Well, a good friend of mine gave me a book called 40 Years, the Saga of Building the Salt Lake Temple. And I read the book, and it just was one of the best things I've ever done. It was just an excellent, excellent resource for enabling me to understand a lot of things that I didn't know about, and to be informed about a lot of things that were, I thought, extremely interesting. I'm going to read the front cover of this little thing that goes on the... As you notice, I have a new puppy dog. And he's really good at eating my things. or defacing them. From the chilly February day in 1853, when the prophet Brigham Young drove a shovel into the soil to break ground for the Salt Lake Temple, until its dedication in 1893, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were confronted with political hostility from the U.S. government, severe challenges imposed by nature itself, and some of the 19th century's greatest events affected this monumental temple building project, including the California Gold Rush, the Civil War, the constitution of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Saints tangled directly with 5 U.S. presidents, Congress, the Supreme Court, Johnson's Army, and hostile governors, biased judges, and zealous marshals, determined to impose the federal government's will on the Utah Territory. Despite these hardships, the Saints moved forward with faith to complete the temple that would become a symbol of their determination to serve their Lord. This has got a picture of the Salt Lake Temple under construction on the front of it, and I'll just let you guys look it over and pass it around while I'm talking, if you would. I was born and raised in Salt Lake City. I was baptized in the dome-shaped structure alongside the tabernacle. And I visited the Salt Lake Temple frequently to do endowments and other temple work. And I have always just felt an awe for that building. It is so awesome. Is there anyone here that has not seen it? Probably not. I don't know if you've just studied the work put into the granite. As you look at that picture, think about how it would be to sculpture a moon or stars or a round window opening, pillars, whatever. Every one of those things were sculptured out of granite. Now, I'm a sculptor, and I've done a lot of different types of sculpturing. And I tried doing it with some sandstone, and I decided it was more work than it was worth. And sandstone is a whole lot softer than granite. So what was accomplished in that project is just miraculous to me. I would just like to mention that one of my favorite things about the Salt Lake Temple was the food they feed you. They had some awesome ladies that cooked homemade pies and cakes, and after a session, I'd love to go get something to eat. It was always yummy. And that was one of the favorite parts of going to the temple, was eating in the temple for me. All right, let's move on. Cultural changes. As I have thought about what it would be like to have lived in the early 1800s and mid 1800s, we just can't hardly believe that they didn't have any electricity, they didn't have any kind of vehicles other than a horse-drawn carriage, etc., etc. And as you think about those kind of things, I was going to sort of give you an example to think about. I was a scoutmaster for 8 years. My dad was a scoutmaster. And we did a lot of fun hikes and outings with the young men. And so I was thinking, how about if Roy Wharton was the scoutmaster of you guys? And I said, hey guys, guess what? We're going to build a box so we can go on a hike and have all of our food in, and it's only going to last for 3 months. How about that? How would you like to live out of a box for 3 months with no refrigeration? You'd have lots of pablum. I just can't hardly imagine doing what these pioneers did and surviving. It's just absolutely amazing to me. It isn't totally connected with the temple, but the saints, when they were traveling to the Salt Lake Valley, they were the product of, well, they ran into a situation, I guess is more important. The United States government was pretty prejudiced against the LDS people because of all of the things that had happened to where they kept getting driven out of places and all kinds of lies and bad tales. So they came to the group of pioneers that were going to the temple area and told them that they needed to come and join them for as a Mormon battalion because they needed troops for the Mexican War. And what these guys had decided is if the men didn't do what they wanted them to, they'd call them traitors and probably give them a real bad time, put them in prison or whatever. U.B. Brown was the person who discovered gold in the mill race of Sutter's Mill and started the California Gold Rush. They scouted up the white quartz that was the mother lode for the flecks of gold they were finding in the mill race. They dragged logs through the dirt, dumped them in the mill race. The boards would overlap, and that would make a perfect riffler for stopping the gold. And they would find these little shiny, bright things and shining in the sunlight, and that's what got them into the gold rush. Well, when Brigham first saw the Salt Lake Valley, he was absolutely amazed by it. And so was Wilford Woodruff, his makeshift ambulance driver. They had been told by the mountain men that had traveled through the area of the Salt Lake Valley that it was just a worthless desert. The soil was bad, probably couldn't grow much in it. And so there weren't very many really good ideas and feelings about what they were headed for. But I'd like to read here. Oh, I wanted to read this one statement of a man named Thomas Kane first. He was a lawyer and abolitionist and was a friend to the saints, and he described their departing years later in a speech to a presentation that he made in Philadelphia. The people of Iowa have told me, he said, that from morning to night, the saints passed westward like an endless procession. They did not seem greatly out of heart, they said, but at the top of every hill, they would stop and then disappear. They were to be seen looking back like vanished Moors on the abandoned homes and their far-seen temple and its glittering spire. The final landmark that the Nauvoo immigrants saw as they crossed was their temple, setting on the highest point of the city, raising above the river another house of the Lord, abandoned to the enemies. That would really be tough, wouldn't it? To have a beautiful home and a little farm and all that stuff and just have it taken over by someone that had no respect for any of it. Here's Brigham's comments as he stood up and said his famous, "This is the right place." If the people of the United States will let us alone for 10 years, we will ask no odds of them, but they would not make it 10 months if they could not grow enough food to feed both the saints already here and the ones yet to arrive before the end of the year. The advance company had set up camp 2 days before, a short distance from what is now the Temple Square, and started getting crops planted. Topsoil was not what you'd call topsoil. It was very hard to plow. And the men built a dam on the later named City Creek, flooded the area so that they could soften it up. And by the afternoon of July 24th, they had 6 acres of potatoes and vegetables in the ground. A thunderstorm that reached nearly over the whole valley broke out later that evening, watering people, animals, and the fledgling crops, and perhaps giving the leaders of the saints a wanted omen that they would all that they wouldn't all starve to death in the coming months. What Brigham did was he got Orson Pratt and 40 men to head out in front of the rest of the group that he was with and improve the road that they'd have to travel was one thing. And the other thing they did was get to the valley early and started figuring out ways to get some things in the ground to grow so that they wouldn't starve to death. So that shows you Brigham's wise ways of doing things. They started exploring around. Well, I'm not sure. I'm missing something here that I wanted to share. Well, I'll just say it. Both Brigham and Wilford were absolutely amazed by what they saw as the sun was rising on the valley. I mean, here they had the sunlight on the lake and beautiful trees and meadow and fresh running water and streams coming right by them. They just thought they had died and gone to heaven. And so that was their impression of the Salt Lake Valley. And I thought that was cool. The mountain of the Lord's house was a temple that he explained to the congregation, and this was Elder Smith in his talk in the first conference that they had there. The congregation then, that they would build it in the Rockies in a city that would sit on one of the highest elevations on the continent, the top of the mountains indeed. On the 26th, Brigham resumed his exploration of the area, took with him Heber C. Kimball, Willard Richards, Orson Pratt, George A. Smith, Amos Lyman, Ezra T. Benson, Thomas Bullock, and Wilford Woodruff. And they walked north of the camp about 5 miles, climbed to the hilltop, the very place, as it turned out, that Brigham had seen in vision back in Nauvoo, what was a proper place to raise an ensign to the nation. From the vantage point of Ensign Peak, they surveyed the valley with a telescope. They were now on a new Holy Land with its Dead Sea, its River Jordan, Mount of Olives, and Galilee Lake. They had their own Jerusalem to build on. The descendants from the hilltop and eventually returned to the camp. Later that day, Brigham was walking with Wilford, going around the grounds near the camp. When they reached a point between the two primary creeks that ran through this valley, there Brigham stopped, and the senior apostle raised his cane and stumped it into the dry dirt of the valley floor and said, "Here will stand the temple of the Lord God." So there we have a little adventure from Brigham Young. Brigham Young was such an amazing guy. The first thing that Brigham wanted to do was build a 15-foot high wall, 3 foot thick, around the temple block. And he was wanting to do that to create a feeling of separation from the world for the Lord's house. And I love to go to the temple in the winter with the lights, decorating everything. And boy, that wall did that. It just made you feel like you were in a different and special world. And I think it helped with just going to the temple, especially because they kept it so beautifully planted with flowers and all that kind of stuff. Let's see, what are we on? There's a man named Truman Osborne Angel, and he was dedicated by the Prophet Brigham to be the temple's architect. And I thought I'd just share you a little bit about his life because it's so memorable to me. Truman suffered terrible financial losses in Kirtland during the 1838, which reduced his family to utter penury. But his testimony remained firm enough that he decided to follow Joseph and the rest of the saints to Missouri that year. The day of their departure, Truman's total assets were a rickety wagon, a balky horse, and not a penny in his pocket, and a family to feed, and 1,000 miles to cover. I certainly wouldn't envy that. He later wrote that he earned money by working odd jobs as the family traveled. They succeeded in reaching Missouri, that they were there less than a year before they were forced to run for their lives from the mobs. They then made their way to Nauvoo, where Truman was called to be the superintendent of joiners on the Nauvoo temple. In that capacity, he worked closely with the church architect and learned how to become one. And I won't read it all, but when you see what kind of a life this man had to lead and how faithful he was, it's just inspiring to me that he was that stalwart. And that's what it would take with the trials that they were facing. As the architect of the church, he got the salary of $3 a day. How would you like to live on that? Oh my gosh. The temple footprint was 90 by 180 by 16 feet deep. Now I helped my dad build an 8-foot basement in the house that we built as a family. Of course, we're still doing that, aren't we, Dave? Matt? But we dug it out with picks, shovels, wheelbarrows, and a lot of sweat. And it was only an 8-foot basement. And the footprint on our house was maybe 40, 50 feet wide by 60 or 70 feet long. The temple was 90 feet by 180 feet. And then 16 feet deep for their basement. That's down there where they had the oxen holding up the baptismal font. But when I dug the trenches for the footers on the house that Matt built for me to live in, and that I truly enjoy, we had to use a jackhammer with a white spoon on it to break the dirt up so that we could dig a ditch starting at a foot deep and take going from there to almost 4 feet deep where it went out into the foundation to the street. And that was for the water to flow in the plumbing system. And that was a huge job. Of course, I was 87 years old, so when you're that old, most things are. But it was a real tough job. And here these guys, I don't know what kind of shovels and picks they had, and wheelbarrows. I'm sure they weren't very good. And they didn't have a pickup truck to haul things away. Had to use a horse and buggy. So they had to haul all of the dirt out of that. And then, when Johnson's army started coming, they put it all back. So then they got to do it all over again after they left. But there was a big celebration on July 23rd. It was 1854, because it was in 53 when Brigham broke the dirt for the start of the building. But in 1854, on July 23rd, they were worried about having everything all set for the big celebration they were throwing. Brigham had a a special road and platforms and everything built for the people to go up by the lake, up the canyon, east of Salt Lake City. And they were having a great big celebration there. But it was right at that time that 4 men come into the camp looking really haggard and dirty. And they brought the news that Johnson's army and a bunch of new government people were on their way to take over in Utah, which kind of spoiled their celebration. But Brigham got together with some of the leaders of the church in his quarters at that time, and they decided that they had already experienced trying to negotiate with government and having their guns taken from them. That just doesn't work. So Brigham decided that he was not going to back down. And he set up, let me see if I can find that in my notes here, and I'll do a better job of it. I didn't mention that the cornerstones that they put in on that celebration were filled with all kinds of cool memorabilia, and these were cornerstones down at the bottom for the walls of the basement. Okay. Brigham's response to the U.S. government was one, that they wouldn't back down, and that if Johnson's army approached the Salt Lake area, that there would be an active warfare begin. And he got together with his leaders, and they came up with the things they would do to defend themselves against the government, and hopefully get them to not come in the way they were doing and take advantage of everything that they had, take charge of it. But here were some of the strategies that they used to keep the soldiers out of Salt Lake. They had a young man in his early 30s named Smith in charge of the Morin Battalion, and they went and burned Fort Bridger to the ground in Wyoming. That was 312 miles away from Salt Lake, because that's where the soldiers were going to come and get themselves ready to come to Salt Lake. And Brigham wanted to stop them there. And so another thing they did is they intercepted the supply wagons that were coming with the food for the soldiers, and they confiscated the food and the animals and whatever. They burned the wagons and the food so that the soldiers wouldn't have that. And then there was when they have cannons and little wagons and things like this to carry their supplies, they have to have a pretty good access to where they're going. Well, the Immigration Canyon, as it comes into Salt Lake, was a narrow canyon with pretty steep walls on both sides. So General Smith had his men build trenches and build defensive walls, just like Moroni was doing with the Lamanites. And they built a dam on the stream that they could quickly set up that would flood the road, and it wouldn't make traveling very good. with cannons and so forth. And then they warned the troops that if they didn't stay out of Salt Lake, that there would be trouble. And the reason for doing that was their hope to stimulate a party, which hadn't been done. The last thing that Brigham planned was not to leave anything that the Army could make use of. And he had the people all leave their homes and set them up so somebody could just set a torch to them and burn them if that came to pass to be the only way to make it hands off. You're not going to gain anything by coming here. So the way they dealt with the temple, as I mentioned, is they covered it up, the work of their foundation, and made it look like just a field that something could be built on, but nothing had been. The reason that this whole thing got started is President Buchanan had a friend who was the mail carrier for the Utah area. And he was a very poor employee. If he crossed a creek and lost a few bags of mail, he didn't worry about it. If things got rained on and wet, he didn't care. He just was just an awful selfish and greedy person. And he got voted out and replaced by a Mormon, so he was very bitter. And he made up this bunch of lies about the Mormons, sent it to his friend, President Buchanan, and he swallowed the whole thing, hook, line, and sinker. And then another guy who was also about the same kind of a person also wrote a similar letter. And so President Buchanan had absolutely no idea what was going on in Utah, and he thought that there was a rebellion against the United States going on there. And that's why he got this big army together to go and his statement was that he would be obliged to put that down in such a way that it would never happen again. And so there was a lot of things going on at this time with the war between the states. And so President Buchanan was drawn between slavery and polygamy. And he wanted to get rid of both of them. And so anything that came across his desk to be signed into law that would be against the polygamy project, he would immediately sign. And so they put together the pattern of legislation for trying to control people and things is that you put forth something really kind of over the top. And then it gets kicked back, and then they adjust it down and make it a little more acceptable, and then try it again, and it would usually pass. Well, the stuff that they put against the saints went through the first time and was stamped okay. And it was very, very abusive stuff that they put in there. Their purposes in setting those laws into being was to actually destroy the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, along with polygamy. When these bad laws were passed, Brigham Young was the first person arrested, and he was going to be put in jail for 20 years and fined like $5,000. And the judge, his name was McKeon, did everything he could to make it miserable for Brigham. Brigham at that time had a lot of trouble with what did they call pains in your joints? Rheumatism. And
Arthritis.
what?
Arthritis.
Yeah, that's what we call it. So here's what this guy had to say. He Brigham went to St. George every winter to get away from the heat, to get away from the cold, and the heat would make it more comfortable for him. So this judge called him back in the middle of the winter to face his arraignment. Judge McKeon had expressly told his jury, which he handpicked and gloried in, no Mormons or anyone favorable to the church in the group. He says, you people of the jury have duties. I have mine as well. My duty is to pick you out and pick you in to fix the trial at such a time as will be least convenient to the defendant, to exclude all evidence that may help him, and to admit all evidence that may hurt him, to rule all points of law against him, to pick out from acts of Congress and acts of the Utah Assembly those laws which can bind many convicts. In the short, gentlemen, my duty is to secure a conviction. How would you like to have a judge like that in charge of your... McKean clearly was no paragon of judicial neutrality, but he was, if nothing else, a man of his word. Thus far, he had certainly made good on his duty to fix Brigham's trial at the most inconvenient time, calling the ill prophet back to Salt Lake from St. George in December, and if he intended to follow through on his other so-called duties, Brigham, Wells, Canyon, and the rest hardly stood a chance in court to be found not guilty. But what happened is the jury were so disgusted with this judge that they acquitted Brigham. That was pretty cool. The Lord works in mysterious ways, don't he? Now, here's another part of the stuff that was passed against the church. By its own estimation, had disenfranchised at least 15,000, that's people, in its first year of operation. With their owners in jail, some businesses had closed, leaving women and children destitute, and the church's role in the territorial economy was greatly reduced. The result was a serious and widespread decline in economic activity, producing suffering and misery for many. But just those who practice, not just those that practice plural marriage, but the saints that was unacceptable to Senator George Edmunds of Vermont. If the saints were not breaking the government would have to apply even more pressure. So in other words, even with all these rotten, dirty tricks that they were pulling, I can't remember the right word for it, but they were collecting all the money from the perpetual education, from the tithing, from every resource of finances that the church had were just being stolen. This Edmunds-Tucker Act was especially bad. It contained provisions similar to some that had been contained in the Merrill Act, which was formally passed, but was effectively ignored. As well, and the reason it was ignored is because the Civil War was the only front of interest for a while there. That was the saints' friend in a way. But it dissolved the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a corporation and declared that all church property held in violation of the Morrill Act of $50,000 limit was escheated, forfeited to the United States government. The Perpetual Immigration Company was dissolved, its assets likewise sealed. The court was empowered to seize any church records granting suffrage to women in Utah and not produced in electoral groundswells against plural marriage. So the women were disenfranchised. They were one of the only states that women could vote in, losing the right to vote that they had enjoyed far more than a decade. Children of plural marriage were legally disinherited. The territorial courts were to take control of the schools. A test oath was imposed on prospective voters, jurors, and government office holders, and the Nauvoo Legion was disbanded. Taken as a whole, the new law was arguably a bid to completely destroy the church's ability to wield any economic or political influence whatsoever, if not to outright destroy the church itself. Some legislators had denounced the bill on these very grounds, but it cannot be denied that this is not a bill to suppress polygamy. Senator Wilkinson's call of Florida declared, he's a senator from Florida, and the methods by which it prepares to suppress this sect, this teaching of polygamy, is the confiscation of the property, the seizures of the contributions of its followers, and then arbitrarily appointing by Congress to such purposes as it thinks proper. Well, that's not what I want to do. Well, I'm going to jump to 404. Prophet Wilford said, one congregation's continuing on would have meant the entire destruction of the church and its works. I think it's really important to look at why the only way that this could be fixed was to get rid of polygamy. And President Woodruff did that. And I'd like to read what he had to say about it. The Lord showed me by vision and revelation exactly what would take place if we did not stop this practice. If we had not stopped it, you would have had no use for any of the men in this temple at Logan, for all ordinances would be stopped throughout the land of Zion. Confusion would reign throughout Israel. Many men would be put in prison, and this trouble would have come upon the whole church, and we should have been compelled to stop the practice. Now the question is whether it should be stopped in this manner or in the way that the Lord has manifested it to us, and leave our prophets and apostles and fathers, free men, in the temple in the hands of the people, so that the dead may be remembered. Quoting Wilford, I saw exactly what would come to pass if there was not something done. I have had this spirit upon me for a long time. But I want to say this. I should have let all of the temples go out of our hands. I should have gone to prison myself and let every other man go there, had not the God of heaven commanded me to do what I did. I went before the Lord and wrote what the Lord told me to write. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And on that thought, I think I'll close the book. But it was really interesting in the book. I'm going to say one more thing. What the women did. The women had big, awesome get-togethers in support of their husbands and announced to the people of the United States how they felt. And they said, if you're going to put our husbands in prison, then we'd like to go with them. But they've got kids to take care of. And all of this stuff that was going on was putting the saints right back in dire straits again financially, which was really, but lo and behold, everything turned around once the polygamy was ended. And the church went forth and prospered greatly after that. So, and when the Salt Lake Temple was completed, what a beautiful statement that makes to the world, the integrity and the artistic abilities of this church. And I'm sure glad to be part of it. And I say this in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Roy.